Hey, it's Jalil, the Tone Canvas, and here's my first episode of my series of oil time lapses. And to begin, here's my usual palette: burnt umber, ultramarine blue or French ultramarine, cadmium red, cadmium lemon, or if you don't have lemon, cadmium yellow light. Um, Also titanium white. That rounds out my basic palette, and I'll be adding burnt sienna for just this specific painting. Alright, so I begin each painting by toning my canvas. I just use thinned out burnt umber and wipe it off, all the excess off with a paper towel. And I roughly sketch out either a still life that I have from life set up in front of me, or if I have any pictures, I'll either print them out or put them on an iPad or something where it's very visible. What I like to do is, paint in the surrounding area, the background, the foreground, just so I get a general idea of the shapes that I'm going to be painting later, just to outline it. It makes it easier trying to block the shapes in later on. See, I blocked everything in, just trying to redefine the background, the folds in the fabric, and then I use the same colors that I'd use for the fabric for the glass, obviously, since it's transparent. Make sure you save some of that excess color that you have from when you're painting your background. Actually, glass isn't as hard as you think it is. It's just looking at the different shapes, blocking them in, and eventually you'll get to the point where it looks like glass. The misconception is that you need to thin down your paint even more to make it more transparent, translucent, but in reality, just blocking what you see and it'll eventually get to where you want it. So here, the basket was kind of intimidating at first. There's obviously a bunch of lines, a bunch of weaving, but I realized this was going to take more than one day, and so I just blocked in with, looks like just burnt umber, and then I knew that I'd have to build the details later, so I begin by adding in the darker parts first, and then building on it with some mid-tone values. I begin every part of the painting going from dark to light, even the bright where the value range isn't as drastic. Just using a lot of mid-tones. Try not to get too dark or too light, but just start out by blocking in the base layers first, and then eventually getting to the bright highlights later on. And that helps build up the realism in the painting. Alright, so now I'm blocking in another piece of glass. There's actually not many colors used, but just as long as you get the values right, meaning the dark and light parts of it, then if you get it accurate, it'll eventually come to look realistic, if that's what you're going for. So this is probably day 2. I'm just going back in, darkening the shadow areas that need to be touched up. As you can see, it's already starting to bring out the background a little bit more, and the foreground I've darkened up that shadow underneath the wood board that my still life is set on. And there I am darkening the shadows in the basket, help define the weaving pattern more. Also adding shadows in the bread and more mid-tones just to more define the bread than it was the last time I worked on it. Alright, I've done all the hard work. Now it's time to put the highlights in. Now usually I don't dry brush like this. Dry brushing just wet on dry technique. Not all done in one sitting, but this painting was so big and detailed that I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to dry brush. I don't mind dry brushing. A lot of artists have strong opinions on it. Some don't like it, some do. I just think if you do it, just make sure you blend everything well and everything will look cohesive. What I'm adding there is not pure white, but it's pretty close. Just don't want to have the brightest bright be everywhere. Then when I add it to the glass or the bread, it won't show through as much. And there I was using a Q-tip to kind of blend out the areas that had too harsh of edges. Kind of my cheat code there. There I am using the Q-tip again. It saves the day a lot of the time. Alright, so here I'm just laying in more highlights. And, it feels good laying in the highlights after doing all the hard work of putting down all the base layers, defining shapes, and blocking in areas. It's rewarding in a way. So here I'm just trying to closely match the color that I see in my setup in real life and adding it in. Now, sometimes it's hard to see highlights. Sometimes you look at it and it looks pure white in real life, but you have to realize I can only save my lightest colors for the lightest highlights of the painting, and that's gonna be your pure titanium white. So here you just add colors to kind of mute it down a little bit first, and then you build on it. So there I'm going, adding the highlights, trying to more define the top of the basket there, and using different varieties of color. Got warm highlights, cool. Just kind of adds more interest to the pattern. And already we can see this painting is coming together more and more. The highlights are starting to bring out everything. So now I'm getting to my brighter highlights. This is almost pure white, but I've probably added a warm mixture to it, like added a little cadmium red, a little cadmium lemon to it to warm it up a little bit, just so that you can tell that the light is flashing on it, but the opacity of the bread is dispensing the light pretty evenly, so there shouldn't be a sharp highlight right there. And make sure you also go with the grain of whatever you're painting. I went with the grain of the bread, and in the end it ended up helping make the bread look more realistic. Same with the weave on the basket. Just make sure everything goes in the right direction, and even just a series of lines going together in the same direction can, in the end, look like what you intended it to look like, which is, in this case, for me, is a basket. There's no need to go crazy detailed. As long as you're in the general direction, the human brain will kind of figure out what it is supposed to look like, what it is that you've painted, which is the one of my favorite things about oil painting in general, or painting in general. You can be expressive and it'll still end up conveying what you want it to in the end, as long as you do it fairly decently. Here I am using the Q-tip again. It's probably my favorite technique I use when I'm doing a painting that takes multiple days, which is pretty often actually, but just apply pressure differently and you end up getting a good result. So I didn't know whether to put this in or not, but it's pretty satisfying, so I was like, why not? This is me varnishing the painting. It was probably a few days later when it started to, get that sort of ashy look to it. Varnishing just brings the colors back out, brings the darks out, the midtones, the highlights back out. And it allows you to see the painting as if it were just freshly painted. I love how the red comes out. It's just striking in the background and looks like the light is illuminating off the bread in the glass, just like how I planned it. This is actually retouching varnish. You can't fully varnish a painting until 6 months to a year after you painted it. But, most artists that make a living off their art can't really do that. Yeah, we've reached the end of this video. If you liked it, please subscribe, and if you want more, go check out my channel.